In the darkest corners of history, where the shadows of betrayal and ambition loom large, there lies a tale of a man whose rise and fall mirrored the turbulent times of medieval England. Richard II, the young and often misguided king, found in Robert de Vere, 9th Earl of Oxford, a friend and ally who would become both his greatest champion and his most tragic victim. The story of Oxford's meteoric rise and catastrophic fall is a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked favoritism, the consequences of personal vendettas, and the fragility of power in a world where loyalty was as fleeting as the summer breeze. The year was 1386, and England was a nation on the brink. The 100 Years' War with France had drained the kingdom's coffers and morale, and the nobility was restless, chafing under the perceived incompetence and favoritism of King Richard II. Among the king's closest confidants was Robert de Vere, a young and ambitious nobleman who had quickly risen through the ranks of the court. Richard, known for his capricious nature and tendency to surround himself with favorites, lavished titles and honors upon Oxford, elevating him to the unprecedented position of Marquis of Dublin and subsequently Duke of Ireland. This unprecedented elevation not only granted Oxford unprecedented power and precedence over all the earls, but also made him a symbol of the king's favoritism, a fact that did not sit well with the nobility. The nobles, already dissatisfied with Richard's rule, saw Oxford's rise as a direct threat to their own power and status. The situation reached a boiling point when a rebellion broke out in Ireland. Instead of sending Oxford to quell the rebellion, which would have at least removed him from the scene and given the nobles some satisfaction, Richard kept him close. The king's decision to grant Oxford regal powers to crush the rebellion while keeping him in England only fueled the nobles' resentment. But the real scandal came when Oxford, smitten by a Bohemian lady in waiting of Richard's queen, Anne of Bohemia, decided to divorce his wife, Philippa de Coucy. Philippa, a woman of royal blood and the daughter of Ingere, and the 7th Lord of Coucy, was not just any wife. She was a symbol of the alliances and marriages that bound the noble families of Europe. Oxford's decision to divorce her in order to marry the Bohemian lady was not just a personal betrayal, but a political one. It infuriated Philippa's royal uncles, the Dukes of Lancaster, Gloucester, and York, who saw it as a direct insult to their family's honor. Despite the outrage, Richard, utterly enchanted by Oxford, not only consented to the divorce but even assisted in the process. He entreated Pope Urban VI to grant the annulment, and the Pope, perhaps swayed by the political ramifications, complied. The entire affair was conducted on the basis of false testimony, and the scandal rocked the court and the kingdom. Oxford's treatment of Philippa was widely condemned, and even his own mother joined in the condemnation by taking Philippa to live with her. The fact that Philippa was of royal blood in Oxford was already unpopular among the nobility only added to the disapproval. While divorce was not uncommon in the Middle Ages, it was the manner in which Oxford handled it that made it particularly scandalous. The year 1387 saw the situation come to a head. A group of nobles, known as the Lords Appellant, presented a formal appeal against Oxford and 4 other councillors of the king's party. They accused them of conspiring to control the king, exclude his proper councillors, and even plot the murder of the Duke of Gloucester. The charges were serious, and the Lords Appellant, led by Gloucester, tasked a commission of government with the powers of a regent. Richard and Oxford, seeing their power threatened, gathered an army to assert the king's sovereignty by force. The conflict culminated in the Battle of Radcot Bridge, where Oxford, facing superior forces, made a daring escape by leaping into the river on horseback, discarding part of his armor and galloping away into the dusk. He fled to Flanders, where he had previously deposited large sums of money with Lombard bankers in Bruges. In February 1388, the merciless Parliament convened, and the Lords Appellant brought charges of treason against Oxford and the Chancellor, Michael de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, who had also escaped. They were accused of a litany of crimes, including conspiring to control the king, impoverishing the crown, and even plotting to return Calais to the French king in exchange for aid against their domestic opponents. The Parliament, in a move that would have far-reaching consequences, sentenced Oxford and Suffolk to be hanged as traitors in absentia. 3 others who had not escaped the Chief Justice, the Mayor of London, and Richard's former tutor, Sir Simon Burley, were executed. Richard, humiliated and stripped of his friend, was left on the throne, a shadow of his former self. The fall of Oxford did not mark the end of the story. Despite the charges and the sentence, Oxford's story took a bizarre turn when he was invited to France in 1388. The invitation came despite the fierce opposition of Engere, and the 7th, Lord of Coucy, who hated Oxford with a passion for his treatment of his daughter, Philippa. Coucy, however, was forced to acquiesce, and Oxford was received at the French court and well entertained. However, Coucy, with the support of other influential figures like Clisson, Riviere, and Mercier, eventually prevailed upon the French king to expel the dishonor of his daughter from France. Oxford found refuge in Brabant, where he would spend the last few years of his life. In 1392, at the age of 30, he was killed in a boar hunt, a tragic end to a life that had once seemed so promising. King Richard, never one to forget his friends, had Oxford's body brought back to England for a reburial. In a poignant ceremony, the king gazed mournfully upon the embalmed face of his former friend, and placed a ring on the dead finger of the man who had once been his greatest supporter. Meanwhile, the divorce having been annulled, Philippa remained the legal Countess of Oxford, a bittersweet end to a tumultuous chapter in history. The story of Oxford's rise and fall is not just a tale of personal ambition and royal favor, but also a reflection of the broader political and social landscape of medieval England. The kingdom was a place of constant turmoil, where alliances shifted like the tides, and loyalty was a rare commodity. The 100 Years' War had left the country exhausted, and the nobility was increasingly restless, seeking to assert their own power and influence in a court dominated by a young and often capricious king. The impact of the war and the plague had left deep scars on the land. Towns and villages were depopulated, commerce was dwindling, and the countryside was in a state of decay. The barony of Coucy, for example, had suffered greatly from the fires of mischief, the lack of laborers, and the ravages of war. The king, recognizing the need to restore the health of this crucial domain, granted Coucy the title of Grand Bouteiller of France and the privilege of holding 2 annual fairs, exempt from taxes, to help revitalize the region. The barony, once a thriving and prosperous area, was now in danger of becoming deserted and uninhabitable, a stark reminder of the toll that war and disease had taken on the land. The decline of the nobility and the peasantry was not limited to the regions directly affected by the war. Picardy, once a prosperous region, was now beaten and chastised, with many peasants fleeing to other regions in search of better opportunities. The same was true for other parts of France, where the marks of a century of woe lowered population, dwindling commerce, deserted villages, and ruined abbeys were everywhere. The climate of pessimism that permeated the era was not unfounded, as the country struggled to recover from the twin scourges of war and plague. Yet, even in the midst of decay, there were pockets of wealth and delight. The castle of Serrafontaine, for example, was a place of enchantment and bucolic beauty, where the elderly and ailing but complacent host, Renaud de Try, lived a life of luxury and comfort. The castle, situated on the banks of a river in Normandy, was furnished as richly as if it were in the city of Paris. The surrounding orchards and gardens, the walled fish pond, and the forests full of game made it a paradise for those who could afford such a life. The lady of the castle, described as the most beautiful in France, lived in her own noble dwelling, attended by 10 richly dressed damsels, who had no duties but to entertain themselves and their lady. The days were filled with prayer, hunting, and merriment, a stark contrast to the hardships faced by the majority of the population. Paris, the heart of the kingdom, was a different story. The city, according to the poet Deschamps, was a place of raucous entertainment and excess. A night out with the Duke of Berry, the Duke of Burgundy, the Duke of Bourbon, and the Sire de Coucy often began with dinner at Berry's residence, the Hôtel de Nesle, and ended in a tavern where the guests would drink, gamble, and revel late into the night. The poet, a keen observer of human nature, saw in these scenes of excess a reflection of the broader moral decay of the age. He lamented the sins of impiety, pride, sodomy, sorcery, and the love of money, which he saw as the root causes of the kingdom's troubles. The story of Oxford and the turbulent times of medieval England is a reminder that even in the darkest of ages, there are always those who find ways to thrive and those who are left to suffer. The line between wealth and poverty, power and powerlessness, was as stark then as it is today. The rise and fall of Robert de Vere, 9th Earl of Oxford, is a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the fragility of power in a world where loyalty is a rare and precious commodity. It is a story that echoes through the ages, a reminder of the timeless struggles of human nature and the enduring quest for power and influence.